The Voice of the Naked Truth. Body, Gender, and Resistance in Olden Days and in Our Day. A Chanukah Midrash by eBenBrandeis ibn Zelig. Biyamim hahem, b'zman hazeh. In those days, at this time. It's a line from the second blessing for the Chanukah candles. And it is said that ancient Israel, along with ancient Greece, invented, i.e., wrote, history. Many Jewish holidays celebrate historical or quasi-historical events. They are based on stories so powerful we feel compelled to tell them to our children through the generations, dor ledor. For example, Passover tells the story of the Exodus from Egypt, based on the text of the Torah. Purim tells the story of the political deliverance of the Jews of Persia, based on the text of the Book of Esther. Chanukah's story is not in the Torah, and there is no canonical text. Its story developed through the ages, based on Midrash, written at different ages in the history of the Jewish people. Stories tell you a lot about the storyteller. When someone criticizes someone else, sometimes that criticism teaches more about the criticizer than the person being criticized. When someone interprets history, sometimes that interpretation teaches more about the interpreter than the history being interpreted. And the same with Midrash. So what about Chanukah? The original Midrash, what I call the National Liberation Front story, is based on the non-canonical Book of Maccabees, written shortly after the success of the Hashmonean Revolt in 163 BCE. When the Book of Maccabees was written, Jews were a sovereign, Hellenistic-style Hebrew Judean kingdom living in their own land. Key elements of the story: national victory of few against many, the weak against the strong. National identity arises by throwing off the yoke of foreign oppression. And the noble fight for freedom, one of humanity's highest aspirations. This is a story that resonates throughout human history, and not just for the Jews. We see it in the myth of the French resistance against the Nazis, or Washington crossing the Delaware. But perhaps the current retelling is best exemplified in this clip from the movie Braveheart, set in 13th century Scotland, as Mel Gibson delivers his stirring speech to the Highland rebels.
What will you do without freedom? Will you fight? Against that? No! We will run! And we will live. Die. Fight and you may die. Run and you'll live. At least a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
Midrash Beit, Rebranding the Chanukah Story by the Talmudic Rabbis, circa 500 CE. After the horrible failure of Bar Kokhba's revolt against Rome in 135 CE, which itself was inspired by the National Liberation Front Chanukah story, the rabbis invent, i.e. write, a brand new Midrash, the story of the tiny remnant of pure oil which lets the sacred light burn 8 nights. This story is nowhere to be found in the Book of Maccabees. It downplays military prowess and instead glorifies divine, abstract light that provides purity, sanctity, holiness, and joy, even in the darkness. There is a focus on the family, the domestic setting, and the traditionally woman's ritual of candlelighting. There is a rededication of what has been broken and despoiled by a higher force of good, which is light, and the light arises from the pure and the good. This is definitely the trope of the American Jewish Golden Age, as exemplified in Peter, Paul, and Mary's song, Light One Candle.
That answers some of those painful questions. It says, light one candle. Candle on Menorah. The Jewish holiday of Chanukah. Light a candle for decency. Light a candle for hope. Light a universal candle for peace. Light one candle for the Maccabee children, with thanks to their light it didn't die. And light one candle for the pain they endured when their right to exist was denied. Light one candle for the terrible sacrifice justice and freedom demand. Light one candle for the wisdom to know when the peacemaker's time is in hand. Don't let the light go out, it's lasted for so many years. Don't let the light go out, let it shine through our love and our tears. Don't let the light go out, it's lasted for so many years. Don't let the light go out, let it shine through our love and our tears.
We can see how Peter, Paul, and Mary totally continue the move that the Babylonian Talmudic Rabbis made, rebranding the holiday from one of military prowess and national liberation to spirituality, the symbolism of light defeating the forces of darkness. Like diaspora Jews throughout 2,000 years of exile, Peter, Paul, and Mary refashioned the meaning of Chanukah, using words and culture of their own time and place. But to come right to Bazman Hazeh, as I write these words, it was literally yesterday that into the world came this clip of the incoming Vice President, Kamala Harris, former Attorney General of the state of California, and her Jewish husband, Doug Emhoff, giving their Chanukah greeting. You can see how the retelling of the real meaning of the Chanukah story is all about contemporary American Jewish context and has almost nothing to do with the original historical story of Chanukah.
Hey everybody, we're here to talk about one of our favorite holidays in our big modern family,
Hanukkah.
And why do you love Hanukkah?
I love Hanukkah because it really is about the light and bringing light where there has been darkness. And there is so much work to be done in the world to bring light. And it is a celebration of always Tikkun Olam, which is about fighting for justice and fighting for the dignity of all people. And it's about rededication.
And it's about joy.
And it's about joy.
And it's about spreading joy around the world and sharing it with your family and your friends and your neighbors and your community. That's important right now.
So that's what we are doing, is to wish everyone a happy Hanukkah. And to your family from ours, we wish you all the best.
Should we light the candle?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
Okay.
Local culture affects the expression of Judaism. For some Canadian content, here is the local Chabad's hockey stick Chanukah, seen in a Toronto grocery store, December 2020. Midrash Gimel. Now I want to introduce a third Midrash, focused on women, that tells us tale of how Channa, daughter of Matityahu the high priest, was the true heroine and instigator of the Maccabean Revolt. Speaking of how local culture affects the expression of Judaism, this Midrash was popular in Italy of the 16th century, when, as a culturally oppressed minority, Jews were forced to live in ghettos, an invention of the Italian republics. After the disaster of the expulsion from the Golden Age of Spain, when Jews had been culturally integrated into Arabic and Spanish society, the ghetto of Venice was established in 1516, and it was only dissolved in 1797 when Napoleon Bonaparte occupied Venice. Think of Shylock in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, which was written in 1600. In this Midrash, we see a focus on the role of women and the sanctity of marriage and family. We learn about the demands on women and the demands of women. And we see how women's bodies are a site of political contestation and collective trauma. But with this third Midrash, before I tell you the story, I want to start from modern times. 2020 CE, Example 1 of Midrash Gimel, Portland's Naked Athena. Here is an iconic photo from July 17, 2020 that went viral. And here is the contemporaneous media report. Quote, after a long day of protesting in Portland, Oregon, where federal officers were dispatched to crack down on Black Lives Matter demonstrations, a sex worker stripped down and positioned herself on the pavement facing a line of police. A newspaper photographer snapped a shot of the performative activist, who quickly went viral on Twitter as the Naked Athena, after the Greek goddess of war. Speaking out on the podcast Unrefined Sophisticates, Jen said she acted on impulse and anger in a heated moment. Quote, there was a very deep feminine place in myself that felt provoked, she said. I'm notoriously naked. I just have been that way for several years now, and there's not anywhere that you can't find me naked. I'm a sex worker, and my nakedness is political. It's my expression. 2020 CE, Example 2 of Midrash Gimel, Jerusalem's naked woman on the state Menorah. Just 4 days after Naked Athena, half a world away in Israel, another woman strips naked as an act of protest. Quote, several protesters climbed on a statue of a menorah near the Parliament building. One woman sparked outrage after she posed topless on a statue of a menorah at a traffic circle near the Knesset, although not the iconic bronze Knesset menorah. She was a social work student. Israel's social workers had just had a 16-day labor strike. Israeli social workers, 89% women, have long complained of what they describe as an unreasonable workload, low salaries, and the constant danger of violence. And their union made the decision to strike earlier in the month after repeated negotiations with the government failed to produce a change in their working conditions. Quote, maybe now, if I take off my shirt, somebody will care about the social workers. It's meant to change perceptions, she said. And now to our third Midrash Chanukah. Midrash Gimel. In this retelling of the oppressive Greek rule, leading up to the Hashmonean Revolt, the Syrian Greek king imposes a series of seemingly absurd decrees to undermine the Jews' belief in their own religion and way of life, and to facilitate their acceptance of the Greek gods and values. The first decree: Jews must remove the locks from all their doors. Why? So that there would be no honor and no privacy or modesty. Anyone may enter day or night, and this would interfere with the domestic harmony of the Jewish household. The Jews, in an act of dafka, went even further and took the doors off the openings to their houses, and this meant they could not eat or drink or have sex in privacy. God explains to them that they would have some benefit from removing the doors in years to come, but meanwhile they bowed to the pressure and endured this first decree. The second decree. When the Greeks saw that the Jews were able to withstand the first decree, they issued a second. Anyone in Israel that had a ram or sheep or ox, even one without blemish, must brand on its horns the word, "This animal has no share in the God of Israel." Why did they do this? So that Israelites could not eat meat or drink milk, and they would not be able to plow. The Greeks believed that this would force the Jews into submission. But the oppressed Jews again undermined the decree by taking it to extremes. They said, "Heaven forbid we rebel against our God with unkosher beasts." So they sold all of their animals. However, because of their response to the earlier decree, when they had removed all their doors, every night wild gazelles and wild birds, which are kosher, came into their homes, and the Jews could slaughter them and eat them, and thus have the food that the Greeks hoped to withhold from their families. The third decree. When the Greeks saw that the Jews were able to withstand the second decree, they issued a third, that any woman who goes to immerse herself in the mikveh, or ritual bath, to purify herself to resume intimate relations with her husband, will be impaled with a sword. And any Greek man who sees her going to the mikveh, she is sexually available to him, and her children will be sold as slaves. When the Israelites heard this, they refrained from sexual relations. But when the Greeks learned of this, they said, "Because the Israelite men are not using their beds and having sex with their women, since the women cannot go to the ritual bath, we, the Greeks, should have sex with the women, since we don't care about ritual baths." When the Israelites' men heard this, they went and had sex with their wives without immersion and against their women's will. The women raised their voice and said to God, "Master of the universe, this is being done without our consent, and not for our well-being. For a woman does not want to lie under her husband, not in accord with her due time or pleasure." And God said to them, "Because you did this unintentionally, I will purify you." And so a miracle occurred, and God opened for each of them a spring inside their own home, and the women could immerse within their own private home in the fulfillment of Scripture, "With joy you will draw waters from the well of salvation." Shavtem mayim b'sason mi ma'ayinei haYeshua. Notably, it is only when the women are on the verge of being raped by their own husbands that God intervened with a miracle to enable purity, sanctity, holiness, and joy in their sexual relations with their husbands. The fourth decree, the rite of the first night. When the Greeks saw that the Israelites were able to withstand even this third decree, they issued the most bitter and foulest decree of all, that no bride standing at the wedding canopy on the night of her wedding could be joined with her groom without the woman having first gone to be sexually possessed by the Greek governor of that place. This is a retelling of the Jus Primae Noctis, the rite of the first night, which is probably mythical, but interestingly, it plays a prominent plot role also in the movie Braveheart. The foreign oppressor and local lord has the right to rape and first sexually possess the local woman, and this motivates Mel Gibson to exact revenge against the rapist overlord and trigger the rebellion. But in the Midrash on Chanukah, here again the Jews respond not by fighting back, but by foregoing marriage. When the Israelites heard this decree, they wrung their hands and refrained from marrying. The daughters of Israel would mature and get old as virgins, fulfilling the verse from Lamentations, "Her virgins grieve, and she is bitter." But then we come to the heroine of the story. Until now, the Israelites under Greek oppression, or rather, the storytelling Italian Jews who cower under Christian oppression, respond to all the decrees by sucking it up, adopting and adapting. The men, in particular, adapt. But it takes a woman to change the arc of the narrative. Before we conclude the story, a brief digression about a famous Jewish heroine in Italy in the 16th century. Italy of Michelangelo was intensely Catholic, and they knew the stories of Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and also such extra-canonical texts as the Book of Judith. And, in a largely illiterate culture of the time, artists painted visual midrash on these stories and characters, and this is seen in the great art of the time. The Book of Judith was actually written in Hashmonean times, but it was ostensibly about the time of the First Temple, when the Assyrians came down like a wolf on the fold, circa 700 BCE. In the story, Judith, a widow, uses her beauty and sexuality to seduce the Assyrian general. And then, when he is drunk and his guard is down, she cuts off his head and brings it back to the Israelite camp. Judith is a favorite heroine and subject, a story with sex and gore. Here are some contemporary versions of the fierce Hebrew woman heroine, Judith. Now, back to the conclusion of our Chanukah story. Channa gains a voice, saves herself, and sparks the revolt. Notwithstanding the horrifying fourth decree of the rite of the first night, it seems that in 167 BCE, the high priest Mattityahu had a beautiful daughter named Channa, and in a perfect family alliance type marriage, she was engaged to marry Eleazar, the son of the Hasmonean warrior class. This is the 2nd century BCE Hebrew equivalent of Kate Middleton marrying Prince William, the daughter of the high priest himself, marrying the son of the leading aristocratic family in Israel. It was such an important marriage for dynastic reasons that even though they would have to comply with the Greeks' fourth decree, and the high priest's daughter would essentially be raped by the Greek governor on the night of her marriage before she could unite with her husband, nevertheless, it was decided to proceed with the wedding. When the day of the wedding celebration came, all the elders of Israel gathered in honor of Mattityahu the high priest and the Hasmonean family, for there were none in that generation as great as them. And they had Channa, dressed in her wedding finery, sitting on a raised palanquin or platform. And just as they were about to sit down to eat, Channa, the daughter of Mattityahu, stood atop the palanquin, raised her arms, and ripped off all her garments. And she stood there, stark naked, before all of Israel, and before her father, and her mother, and her father-in-law. This public display of nudity was too much for her family. When her brothers saw this, they were ashamed, and bent their heads to the ground, and tore their clothing, and then stood up to kill her. But Channa found her voice. She called out to them and said, "Listen, my brothers and my uncles. Now that I stand before you righteous ones, naked, but with no sin upon me, you are seized with zeal against me. But you are not so zealous on my behalf, and will send me to that uncircumcised one so that he can abuse me. Should you not learn from Jacob's sons, Shimon and Levi, the brothers of Dinah, who were only 2, yet they were zealous for their sister, who was raped by the prince of Shechem. And by guile and violence they killed all the men of the city of Shechem. Yet you are 5 brothers, Yehuda, Yochanan, Yonatan, Shimon, and Eleazar, and there are over 200 young priests. Place your trust in God, and God will assist you, as it is said, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." Like a learned rabbinic Jew, Channa exposes their hypocrisy. If you were willing to kill me on account of my public nudity, should you not be willing to kill the Greeks on account of their intention to rape me? Channa has taken on a leadership role. She has used her voice, and she has used her nakedness to motivate her brothers to the proper path. At that moment, her brothers were seized with zeal on her behalf, and they consulted with each other, and they said, "Let us take our sister, and we will go to the great king and tell him, 'Our sister is the daughter of the high priest, and there is no one in Israel greater than our father, and we see that it is not fitting that she should lie with a mere governor, but rather with the king himself, who is as great as we are. And then we will enter the palace with her, as if to bring her to the king, but then we will kill him and his servants and his relatives.'" And so they used their sister like a female Trojan horse, as an opportunity to assassinate the king. And thus it was Channa who opened the floodgates of Hashmonean male energy to rout the Greek overlords. Throughout this tale, the home, the family, and the woman's body serves as the site of adjudication for the collective honor of Israel and the integrity of God's name. Channa's action and speech were the key to the great victory of the Hasmoneans, because Channa was willing to expose herself, to challenge her brother's hypocrisy, to challenge the Jewish men's willingness to adapt and accommodate to immoral decrees, and instead galvanize them into action. In this midrash, Channa is a powerful, smart, and decisive woman, taking her fate, and that of all the Israelites, into her own hands. It is her command of rhetoric, morality, halakha, Bible, and drama that forces the hands of her brothers, who, following her lead, succeed in freeing the Jews from the Greeks and their humiliating decrees.